Okay, this is the video lecture number 1 for my Introduction to Psychology students. This is a lecture that's going to make up for the class that we've missed in the last week or so. So I'm using this in a lot of my classes. So I want to talk about clinical description. We're going to talk a little bit about how we start to define and explain and understand mental health disorders, and also kind of how they run in terms of their course, how present they are in the general population, and things of that sort. So, clinical description. Now, when we talk about a clinical description, we're talking about essentially a clinical way of describing or explaining a problem. In class, we've talked a little bit about depression. We've talked surfacely about anxiety and anxiety problems. And now we're actually going to start to talk about a clinical description. We all have ideas in our minds about what depression is or isn't, for example. Now, the way this all starts is someone comes into our office. As a psychologist or a therapist, someone comes into my office, sits down, and tells me that they feel like they have a problem. So by definition, and you'll want to write this down, the presenting problem is the problem that the client describes. Okay? In other words, the presenting problem, we're talking about the issue or issues that the client is reporting that he or she has. It could be one problem, it could be a host of problems, but it's coming from the client. Okay? Now, just because the client is describing the problem, you may have a client who comes in and says, "Yeah, I feel like I have depression. I'm jittery. I'm not sleeping at night, and I'm kind of afraid to go out into public in certain places." And really, what they're describing is anxiety. The person may feel like he or she has depression, but the more I listen to him or her, the more I may realize it's not really the problem that the client thinks he or she has. It may be something different. And that's where, as a psychologist, I have to use my clinical judgment. So, now the treated problem, on the other hand, this is the problem or the disorder that the mental health professional diagnoses and subsequently treats. So again, I can't underscore enough, go back for a second. The presenting problem from the client may end up being exactly what we treat. Sometimes a client will come in to the office, or if I'm working in the prison, will describe symptoms of depression and will just tell me, "I really feel like I'm depressed." And sometimes they are right. Sometimes they are. But sometimes it's something a little different. So the treating problem, and get this in your notes somewhere, can be different from the presenting problem. Not necessarily, but it can be. Okay. So again, our clinical description, I think I said this at the beginning of the video, is the psychological description, the clinical description of whatever the disorder is. The example I'm going to use here is depression. And I realize it might be hard to read some of this. I'll read it off to you. You should be able to zoom in on this or maybe see it. Here's a clinical description of depression. It's a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. It's also called major depression, major depressive disorder, or clinical depression. It impacts how you feel, think, and behave, and can lead to a variety of emotional and physical problems. It may create problems doing normal day-to-day things, activities. And depression can make you feel that life isn't worth living. It can actually also lead to suicidal thoughts as well, or even intentions, unfortunately. It's more than just a bout of the blues. Depression is not a weakness, and it's not something you can simply just snap your fingers and kind of wake up from or snap out of. So what I've read to you is a clinical description of depression. It's not just a guess or just, well, I think it's just when you're in a bad mood for a day, you have depression. That's not a clinical description. This gives you a more accurate depiction of what it is. In class, I mentioned our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders that we use to diagnose lots of different types of mental health disorders. And in that manual, there's a clinical description of every disorder. And I just happened to give you a clinical description of depression here. Now, prevalence. We're going to talk about prevalence and incidence at this point. I'll give you some examples. We'll talk about depression, for example. And you don't have to memorize this slide. I just kind of put that in there for you. You can pause it and look at it. We're talking about a percentage of the population that has a given disorder. That's prevalence. We could even look at it as a percentage of a specific population. We can define population in several ways. We could look at the United States population. We could look at men only. We could look at women only. We could look at adolescents only. So here are some examples of prevalence rates. Now, I'm not interested as much in you memorizing these statistics as much as I am worried about you understanding what prevalence means. So for major depression in the United States, approximately 5.3% of adults, or 17 million people, suffer from major depression. So that gives you a quantitative piece of information. 5.3% that suffers from major depression at this time. Approximately 4% of adolescents have major depression right now. And this is just one type of depression, mind you. If you want to look at it in terms of men and women, approximately 6.5% of women have depression, major depression right now, and approximately 3.3% of men have major depression right now. So again, with prevalence, let me go back so you can see the word again. We're looking at a percentage of the population that has a given disorder. And again, we can define that population however we want to, for the most part. Okay? All right. Some more examples of prevalence. One of my favorite disorders to talk about, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder. This is another anxiety disorder. Approximately 3 to 8% of people, depending on what statistics you look at, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Approximately 10.4% of women, approximately 5% of men. So when you average that out. Sleepwalking disorder. That is a disorder as well, approximately 1 to 5%. Now children will sleepwalk, maybe more than you will think. Approximately 10 to 30% of children suffer from a sleepwalking disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder, approximately 2.5%. If we want to narrow our definition of population to just mental health clinics, you can kind of see here that approximately 3 to 5% of mental health patients in clinics suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder. I know it's kind of hard to see because of the angle here, but hypochondriasis, the hypochondriac. I'll read this off to you in case there's a glare here. Approximately 1 to 6% of the population suffers from hypochondriasis. Another prevalence rate, if you look specifically at medical populations only, so people who are in treatment or seeking treatment for medical problems, not even mental health problems, approximately 1 to 14% of these people in this specific population suffer from hypochondriasis. Then we have the idea of incidence. Now, incidence differs from prevalence. With incidence, I'll give you some examples here. We're talking about new cases of a certain disorder within a specified amount of time. A lot of times, incidence rates are set up in terms of a calendar year. So we're looking at new cases in the last year. So for major depression, for example, approximately there are 3 to 5 new cases. There were 3 to 5 new cases per 1,000 people last year alone. So in the United States. Now in Canada, with major depression, you were looking at approximately 9 new cases per 1,000 people in the last year alone. So again, we're looking at new cases within a specified period of time. Now, in the United States Army, statistics regarding post-traumatic stress disorder. We see this a lot in the armed services. From 2006 to 2007, there were 14,000 new cases diagnosed across all branches of the military. That's, again, within a defined period of time. From 2005 to 2006, there were about 9,500 new cases diagnosed across all branches of the service. And then from 2003 to 2004, approximately 1,632 new cases of PTSD across all branches of service. So those are, again, some more examples of incidence rates. So again, just kind of understand when you're taking notes here the difference between prevalence and incidence. I know it's probably not real exciting stuff, but it's important just to kind of understand what those terms mean and the difference between them. Now, we move to course. When we talk about the course of a disorder, we're talking about sort of how it develops from the very beginning to the middle to the very end. How does this disorder unfold? So again, when we talk about course, we're talking about specifically how a specific mental health disorder unfolds and evolves over time. I would write that down. Okay. Now, we delineate course three ways: chronic, recurrent, or episodic, or isolated, or one time. Now, most disorders are not chronic, but some are. A chronic disorder implies that this is a disorder that's going to last for a very long time, if not for an entire lifetime. Most mental health disorders are not chronic, but schizophrenia is an example of one that is. It pretty much lasts from the point you get diagnosed with it, you pretty much have it until you die. That's not to say it cannot be treated, it can be, but those symptoms and that disorder is not ever going to go away. A lot of disorders are episodic or recurrent. That means they come and go. An example of that could be bulimia. We've talked about eating disorders a little bit already. Generally, someone who's bulimic isn't always that way. There can be periods of time where they are in recovery and where they're not bulimic. Some people who were bulimic early on, like maybe during adolescence, have sought treatment and have come through that, and they are no longer so. But sometimes disorders can kind of come and go. Depression, we're going to talk about that here in a second under the next category, but depression can also be recurrent. On average, if a person has one episode of major depression, they tend to have at least 5 more throughout the course of a lifetime. You may go 5 years without another episode of depression. Then it may be another 10 years before another episode of major depression ensues. So it's episodic. It comes and goes. And then you have the one-time or isolated. So sometimes people suffer from a mental health disorder that's just a one-time thing. Some anxiety disorders. Sometimes depression, for example. And I would know those courses, those delineations of course, those chronic, episodic, and isolated. I would have those in your notes somewhere. So there's some images of schizophrenia, which tends to be chronic. Image of bulimia, which tends to be recurrent. There's another image of bulimia there. And of course, major depression, which can be isolated. It can be a one-time thing, especially if it's situationally induced, like the death of a child or a traumatic event that happens in the environment, for example. Then we have onset. The onset, by definition, of a disorder refers to when it happens. When does it start to occur? When do we start to see the symptoms? Okay, so in other words, onset means when does this disorder begin? For example, schizophrenia, usually we see this during the late teens to early 20s. That's when the onset of schizophrenia generally occurs. It's not really younger than that, and it's rarely much older than that. Men, it's a little younger. It's around 18 years of age, and for women, it's about 25. Antisocial personality disorder, late teens to early 20s is where you kind of start to see this, but not really before the age of 18. You generally don't see those symptoms come on before that. And you generally don't see symptoms of antisocial personality disorder develop into, your 30s and 40s. Generally, it's much before that. With anorexia, it's early adolescence is when you start to see the symptoms come onto the scene. All mood disorders taken together is about 30 years of age. Autism, which is a pervasive developmental disorder, it's almost always before the age of 3. Rarely, if ever, will you see autism begin in the teenage years or in your 20s. It just doesn't happen that way. So onset for different disorders, it's going to be different. So we're again talking about when the disorder begins. And then you have the prognosis. The prognosis, by definition, is how well you can recover from a disorder, or what can you predict about feeling better or recovering from this disorder. What's the outlook? It's kind of like taking a weather forecast. The prognosis for some disorders is pretty good, for others not so much. For schizophrenia, it's fairly poor. Prognosis is pretty poor. You don't really recover from that so much. So, hypochondriasis, again, is pretty poor. The hypochondriac is the person who thinks he or she is sick all the time. Anytime they hear a story on the news about a disorder, they think they have it. Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang is my example of that, by the way. Great show, if you haven't seen it, by the way. Highly recommend it. Major depression can be moderate to even good. With therapy and medications, a lot of people can recover nicely from major depression. So the prognosis for depression would be good. Chances of recovery, in other words, would be good. For anxiety disorders, depending upon the anxiety disorder, can be moderate to good, again. So, and every disorder has a little bit of a different prognosis or chances of recovery. So that's pretty much it for that video. Thank you very much.